Okay. Okay, and now it's February 17th, 2025. This is Dan Whitman, and today we're going to talk, among other things, we're going to talk about Paul Nitze. Now, um, let me try to remove okay, and I can make this larger. Okay, now, Paul Nitze, we talk about him sometimes in contrast to George F. Kennan. And I should say up front, these two were opposites psychologically and strategically, and in every way they were opposites. They had every reason to dislike each other, to work against each other. But one of the wonderful things about this relationship, they always disagreed, and they always maintained a certain friendship. Now, to be a bit reductionist about it, Kennan, containment. Okay, we've talked about that. When Kennan published, well, when he sent his long telegram, 1947, sorry, 46, at the request of the State Department, he inserted this word containment. Again, I've in this very long telegram, the longest, one of the longest ever written, I think I saw the word once, maybe twice, the word containment. He never meant for that word to be associated with him. When it was associated, and his X article, which people figured out almost immediately, oh, that's Kennan, because he's talking about Gibbons, and he's talking about Thomas Mann. It's got to be Kennan. So it was published anonymously in Foreign Affairs, which is the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations. People figured out immediately, and he didn't mind. But as this concept, it was very subtle. It wasn't very clear. What did he mean by containment? We only knew later in his life. Two more are welcome. Here we go. We only knew later in life what he meant by containment. I've talked about this a bit before. He really meant avoid conflict. That's really what he meant when he talked about containment. And President Truman and others took the concept and they kind of hijacked it. They made it into the basis of the Truman Doctrine, which was a very belligerent doctrine. I'm not saying that's good or bad, but the Truman Doctrine, simplified, was a clear communication with the Soviet Union. We see what you're doing. You've taken countries in Eastern and Central Europe. You have taken them, you've enslaved them. Let's say, I'm overstating it. You've enslaved them, but we draw the line at Greece and Turkey. If you do anything in Greece and Turkey, we will respond militarily. And again, I'm referring to things I've mentioned before, but Kennan was furious because that wasn't really what he meant. What he really, and when he later had strong objections to the war in Vietnam, and by the way, was opposed to NATO expansion. He was opposed to being provocative towards the Soviet Union. He was confident that the Soviet Union would collapse in given time and patience, that American values would prevail. He had very mixed feelings about America. He found it somewhat vulgar. He was an elitist. He wasn't really comfortable with his own society, but he was he had much more faith in the future of America than he did in the Soviet Union. He loved the Soviet people. He hated their regime. He hated Stalin. So Nitze and Kennan was mentally unstable. Okay, he had a nervous breakdown at one point. He was always in doubt. He always felt he wasn't properly appreciated. Um, he was given this position under Truman. Um, his mentors went to Truman and said, "Why don't you create a put him in, call him um, the make this thing called the Office of Policy and Planning and give it to him, and it won't do any harm." And Truman dismissively said, "Yes, go ahead and do that." And he felt ostracized. He felt rejected. He had some elements of paranoia. When I say paranoia, I mean it in the pedestrian sense, not the psychiatric. I'm not making a diagnosis, but he felt his whole life, he lost his mother at the age of 6 months, and he felt he was guilty for his mother's death. And there's that second biography that I mentioned, the Frank Castigliola, talks more about Kennan, the troubled person, and then his ignominious departure from when he finally got to be ambassador to Moscow, and lasted something like 7 months because of his gaffe at the airport in Berlin, when the journalist said, "So how is it in the Soviet Union?" And he said, "Kind of like Nazi Germany." And Stalin PNG'd him. So Kennan was a unhappy, uncertain of himself. But what we know about his approach to strategy, he really believed in be patient, be the gardener, and let things happen. And you'll see the Soviet Union will decline because it's riddled with imperfections, and it's not going anywhere. It turns out he was right. Nobody, including him, nobody would have known it would take 70 years. Okay, along comes Paul Nitze, in every way the opposite. Nitze was a man of confidence, a man who was sure of himself, and in terms of strategy, he strongly believed in being belligerent. If Ronald Reagan built such a weapons capacity that it eventually brought down the Soviet Union, Kennan would not have advocated that, but Nitze did. Nitze said, hard power, just build up the weapons and just keep antagonizing them, and finally you'll see that they will fall. Now, interestingly, with these opposite approaches, these two people were quite friendly. It's amazing. I can't imagine such a friendship existing these days. Kennan was slightly older by 7 years, but by 4 years. Nitze lived long. He did not live 101 years as Kennan did, but Nitze was a rebel. He came from a very elite academic family, and he discarded all of that, and he went into investment. Let's have a look. He comes to our attention through this recent book, James Graham Wilson, who I had always been aware of Kennan, but and in fact, I met him a couple of times during some of the arms negotiations at the end of the Cold War. I knew he was important, but I really didn't know much about him. And this book by James Graham Wilson suddenly came out last year, and it was very important. This other book, which tells that this is written by the son of Nitze. And as you see, hawk and dove, obviously we're talking here about Nitze, the hawk, Kennan, the dove. Now that we know more about what Kennan really was about, he was enigmatic. When he was alive, what's containment? What is that? Now we know he was a realist. He was a realist, but a dove. It's an interesting combination. America's Cold Warrior. Nitze He was occasionally a Democrat, occasionally a Republican. It's not that he was an opportunist. He did change his mind. He didn't have strong political ideology. He just believed that if we increase the number of weapons, um, this would be the way to deal with the Soviet Union. And then here's that second book written by Nitze's son. It's a very good book, Nicholas Thompson. Um, and you see them there in this picture. They're kind of friendly. Maybe somebody just told a joke. They really got along quite well. I find this fascinating. Opposite approaches to strategy, opposite personality traits, rather good friends. Not very close friends, but they respected each other, and they assisted each other in advancing their opposite ideas. So when Nitze was 7, his father, who was an eminent uh, professor at the University of Chicago, Romance languages um, was his field. And Nitze, as a teenager, later, he looked at what his father was doing, and his father's colleagues. These were a very elite group at the University of Chicago. Nitze thought as a teenager, this is nonsense. This has no value. I'm not going to do academia. That's a waste of time. And this is important in how he created his profession. By coincidence, he was at the age of 7, he was taken to the Tyrol, in the sort of just below the Alps. The Tyrol extends from, as you know, from Italy to Austria. This rocky. He went on a vacation. Very few Americans would just go to the Tyrol for the summer just to breathe the air. This was a very small elite of Americans who could ever have done such a thing. By coincidence, while the family was in the Tyrol, the Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28th. And you know the significance of that. Um, it could have been a false flag. I'm not into conspiracies, but I kind of think the Austrians did this as a sign of provocation, sort of a induced fiction that the Archduke Ferdinand, next in line to become the Archduke in Austria, assassinated in Sarajevo um, by a Serbian national. This is how the history books still put it. And I wonder whether Austria was very unhappy with the Serbian nationalism that came under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think they wanted an excuse to invade Serbia. That's Dan Whitman. Nobody has ever proved this, but they may have done this to create a casus belli, to allow them to invade Serbia, which then became the beginning of World War I. Now, during that same trip in 1914, the Nitzes, they received the news of the Archduke's assassination, and they said, well, it's not going to ruin let's get out of Austria. It's not going to ruin our vacation. We're going to the beautiful city of Munich. And there, Paul Nitze, as a 7-year-old, saw German soldiers being cheered, and he saw Hitler as a 7-year-old. So, this made an impression. And he saw in Munich the crowds cheering Hitler. So they went back. Remember, he's only 7 years old at this point, but this is formative. This is a pretty vivid memory that Nitze had for his whole life. Went back in September, and you know what happened in August, September 1914, the breakout of the most catastrophic war in human history at that point. They were well aware that the Nitzes were well aware that this was a major event. I guess even as a 7-year-old, he probably was imbued with the importance of what do you do when there's a conflict. Okay, so back at the University of Chicago, back home after that summer vacation, um, Nitze, as a young boy, um, he found universities. These were the finest universities in the US, University of Chicago, later went to Harvard. He said, this is nonsense. This is beneath my dignity. Um, this is a cute little quote, Harvard 1928. I distinguished myself by getting the lowest mark ever given at Harvard, a 0, in the course on the history of economic thought. The most beautiful girl suggested that I go down to Newport for the weekend on the first day of the final exam. He was cute. And I mean that in a pejorative way. He he was arrogant, and he he left Harvard to become vice president in the year of the Great Depression, 1929, of a major investment firm in New York. And, during the Depression, not all investments suffered. There were those few that learned how to turn the Depression to their advantage. And one such organization was this one, Dillon Read and Company, where Nitze was. He thought academics is a waste of time. I'm more interested in practical things, and by the way, in making money, which he did even during the Depression. Uh, he signed up. He tried to be a good boy. He signed up for a program in sociology, and he dropped out. Okay. Now, he was very successful during the worst economic year of American history at Dillon Read, whose president was James Forrestal, later Secretary of the Navy and under Roosevelt, and their ships and battleships named after Forrestal. And then a famous telegram, famous within the Nitze family, in 1940, the war had broken out in Europe, but the United States had not yet entered the war. And Nitze in New York received a telegram from his boss saying, be in Washington Monday, Forrestal. That was it. That was the whole telegram. And the purpose, and Nitze did not doubt that if Forrestal would send such a message, this was something he really had to deal with. It had to do with building up the war effort that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was beginning to work on. Roosevelt, we know, was first among Americans in understanding that America would be involved in World War II, knowing that the population in America was largely isolationist. Roosevelt understood that free Europe, needed America once again. Again, Wilson in World War I had been very reluctant, but events, the U-boats and the commercial ships being sabotaged and so forth, Wilson, having run on a platform that I will not take you to war, took America into World War I. Likewise, Roosevelt. Roosevelt, we know, during the first 2 or 3 years of the war, was in close contact with Churchill. They worked very closely together. They met in North America, in Canada, and Roosevelt understood where this was going. That the U.S. was eventually going to be provoked, as it was at Pearl Harbor. Now, in the middle of the war, Nitze did go to Washington. He did work with Forrestal, and this was, you could call it a shadow command group. These were not, there were civilians working on the military buildup that Roosevelt believed would be necessary. But simultaneously, Nitze was, he was arrogant, well, arrogant. He was confident. He was so confident. He knew that he knew, and he believed that he had no doubt in himself. So he created this thing, the School of Advanced International Studies, which is now a very famous school taken over by Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He created it in the middle of the war, 1943, as a center of study for business leaders. Okay, again, he was more anchored in business than he was in government or military or strategy. He was a businessman and certainly was a strategist, but he kept going back to the investment side of things. He obviously believed in the private sector. When he came from New York to Washington, he was kind of a Democrat. He was not a very strongly ideological political Democrat, but when Roosevelt acted to pack the court, Americans are familiar with this term. Roosevelt had a very strong program to revive American economy after the devastating Depression. And the Republican Congress was preventing a lot of these programs from being passed in Congress. And so FDR threatened to pack the court. That would be the Supreme Court, 9 members. He said, well, let's give it, the Constitution doesn't say how many, let's give them 15, because like today's court, which is overwhelmingly conservative, Roosevelt dealt with a similar configuration, and his idea was, well, if the court isn't agreeing with me, let's change the court. Nitze did not like this. He felt this was intrusive. This was a sly bit of trickery, and we don't know if he ever had any like very dramatic, strong feelings about this, but he became a Republican in opposition to Roosevelt's attempt to change the composition of the Supreme Court. Okay, World War II. Nitze had some German ancestry, and by the way, he used to say, my name Nitze comes from a Greek word Nike, which means victory, and he was quite proud of this lineage. Again, he was an elitist. He was very comfortable with his own origins. He initially was opposed to having the U.S. enter the war. I don't know exactly whether it was a different point of view of the German-speaking world. As a 7-year-old, he had seen the crowds in Munich cheering Hitler. So Nitze had principles, but he changed them. He was a Democrat who became a Republican, who later worked for Democratic and Republican presidents. He had his misgivings about the entry of the U.S. into World War II, but once it happened, he became very involved in trying to make it as successful as possible. He never served as a soldier, but he was very, very involved in the military buildup in the United States. He sort of related to the Marshall Plan was a general global relief program. This has to do with money. And Nitze had everything to do with money. He was an investor. He never really completely terminated his activities in the stock market in New York, and he became quite wealthy. So he straddled things. He straddled political parties and ideologies. He straddled New York and Washington. While in Washington, he got to know Kennan, Chip Bolin, Dean Acheson. These were the most influential State Department diplomats in the United States. He got to know them. And very interestingly, the most interesting irony, the Office of Policy and Planning, which was created for George Kennan. When Kennan ended his career in 1953 and was asked, who should follow you? He said, I think Paul Nitze. This is fascinating. These two, they disagreed about everything. They were quite friendly. And you could say, if you could say that the decline of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1991, if it was a result of a strategy, I think you could say it was Kennan on the one side advocating, don't provoke, just let things happen, let it fall. I'm optimistic it will fall on in its own weight. Nitze, exactly the opposite. He said, provoke, provoke. I am very pessimistic. He worked for George Shultz the optimist, Nitze the pessimist. Carter the optimist, Nitze the pessimist. Nitze was there in the background. He never had a major title, and he didn't really care. He was never Secretary of Defense. He was never Secretary of State, but he often had secondary positions. And for him, that was fine. If he didn't like something that was happening, he quit. He quit. And then he came back. He worked under many administrations. And Nitze was the pessimist and the hawk. He was the hawk. Just build up the weapons, and you'll see they will exhaust themselves and we'll get them. The opposite of Kennan. So I find it wonderful and fascinating that when Kennan left, Kennan chose Nitze as his successor. Now, NSC 68, which was this was National Security Council secret memo in 1950. Leaping to the present, we heard talk in Munich yesterday about I think it was Hegseth and Vance, both of them said, Hegseth said, we told you need to spend 2% of your GNP on defense. Now we're saying you need to spend 5%. This offended a lot of Europeans. They said, well, we did what you said. We did the three. Some of us are at 3%. Not enough, Hegseth says. You need 5%. Did you know that in 1950, the US was spending 15% of its GNP on defense? So what we're doing now is relatively little compared to a post-World War II American military presence. Now, in contrast to Kennan, Nitze advocated deterrence over diplomacy. He said, diplomacy, again, he associated diplomacy with these intellectual elites, the university people, Chicago, Harvard. He found that lightweight diplomacy. No, just make it impossible. Create overwhelming military strength. That is the best way to defend America and the West against the Soviet Union. He was a pessimist. He saw no chance that the Soviet Union would see the light or become a democracy or become less of a malign influence. He saw them, I think maybe correctly, as an evil empire, as Reagan later put it. He was a pessimist. Kennan was George Shultz. It's marvelous to me how all these people with very different views managed to work together and in the end collectively succeeded. I find that fascinating. Nuclear weapons were certainly a factor after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And very quickly, of course, the Soviet Union had spies and sources in the West that gave them the technology. Suddenly, there was a nuclear arms race, and this was really scary. And Nitze said, well, I don't know how this happened, but we've got nuclear weapons. They've got nuclear weapons. Our choice, the room for maneuvering is in conventional weapons. There was a CFE, Conventional Forces in Europe, agreement. Even as the nuclear forces were being enlarged, conventional weapons were a major item of concern. There was CFE, I forget what year, Conventional Forces in Europe, which was a treaty between NATO and the Soviet Union. Because conventional, if you're not going to use nuclear weapons, people were already aware, if you ever use them, that's the end. The whole human race will perish. So Nitze was mindful of that. He said, well, it's a very small chance there would be a nuclear war. So we need to increase our conventional weapons. Weapons, weapons, weapons. Nitze was all about that. Kennan disagreed with him. And interestingly, they had vacations together and picnics. It's very interesting um, relationship. I should mention here, because I might forget, I was in a background press briefing once. I think it was at the end of the INF negotiations, intermediate range nuclear forces. And I was the fly on the wall. Um, Tom Friedman was in the room, and all the journalists who were following the technical aspects of nuclear negotiations. And I remember sitting there understanding not a single word. Nitze was speaking without notes. I think he was sitting on the floor, if I remember. Um, and he was talking about throwaways and slickums and bickums, and the journalists understood because they were specialists. And I remember thinking, I'm in this room, I don't know what they're talking about because I had no background. It was very technical what Nitze did, and he was absolutely brilliant at knowing what had been said by the other side 2 weeks ago, and he spoke very informally and very confidently. That I remember. During the Berlin crisis, he was Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security. So he, as far back as 1961, um, that's the Berlin crisis when the Soviets built the wall. And then the next year, the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was still Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security, a title most people would never notice. But there he was working on these two huge challenges. Um, After Kennedy came um, Johnson and Nixon, became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of Defense. He negotiated SALT I. SALT is Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, where the Soviet Union and the United States were having regular talks. Both understood there has to be an agreement. The Soviet Union was always trying to cheat and break out, but there was a mechanism for inspection that the Soviet Union understood if they tried to cheat under SALT I, they will be found out. And so at that time, um, um, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, throughout that period, the Soviets understood, and this was Nitze's work. Nitze negotiated the details, the fine details of these agreements in such a way that it would be impossible for the Soviet Union to secretly violate these agreements. SALT II, 1972, had to do with these more sophisticated weapons. These are horrible things, MIRVs, multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles. Okay, these were the things that Putin is now using. These a single missile which would spread and have many payloads and be able to cause huge destruction through um, through various missiles coming at the same time, or one missile breaking apart into others. These are ghastly, horrible things. And Nitze knew that, but he knew in such detail what they were and how to control them that he really gets credit for these SALT 1 and SALT 2 agreements, which were in the mutual interest of both sides. Now, during Watergate, um, which coincided with the anti-ballistic missile treaty of 1974, that was Watergate. ABM, he was very involved in that. There are many of these agreements. Very sadly, today, many of them are no longer operative because Putin has just decided to abandon them, and Trump, who withdrew from the INF agreement in his last administration. So these agreements kept the world not safe, but at least stable for these 50, 60 years. There were, as long as there were talks and exchanges, and the Soviets and the Americans who negotiated got to be almost friendly. They would get to know one another. This was a positive thing. This prevented horrible nuclear holocaust. And Nitze gets a lot of credit for that. During the Watergate incident, and I remember Watergate as an agonizing thing that took a year and a half before Nixon finally was convinced by his own political party, you will be prosecuted, you will be impeached, you really should resign, and he did. That was the right outcome. Nixon, that's a whole other part of American history, but Nitze found this so depressing. He believed in hierarchies and elites, and when he saw that the president left in such an ignominious way, he said, "Oh well, I quit. I'm out of this." President Carter, who was sometimes they call him a dove, he was a realist actually, but he was a dove. Carter didn't have much use for Nitze. They just weren't compatible. And let's see, Carter excluded him as too hawkish. And Carter was opposed to SALT because he found it too militaristic. And yet later got President Reagan to comply with SALT. This was all Nitze in the background, always in the background. Nitze was never a very public figure. People knew his name, but his work was so technical, it was pretty difficult to actually understand, and also secret, because these agreements were they were ratified by the Senate, but they were so complicated, and there were so many elements that were secretive. Very few people understood any of this. We knew there was this guy, Paul Nitze, and we didn't really know what he was doing. So he bounced around between Republicans and Democrats. He worked with both. He worked with Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Bush Jr., Bush Sr., Bush Jr. The famous walk in the woods, that was Nitze. You've heard the expression walk in the woods. In 1982, he, in eastern France, in the Jura Mountains, he had a walk in the woods with a Soviet counterpart. And this was the beginning of what later became the INF agreement, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. Now, I think you're familiar with what an INF is. A strategic missile, I'm making it up, it goes something like 10 to 20,000 kilometers, something like that. Strategic. Battlefield tactical nuclear weapons, which have never been used. These are the things that Putin keeps threatening he will use if pushed. But then in the middle were these intermediate range nuclear forces, which had a range of, say, 5,000 kilometers, 2 to 5,000 kilometers, by which a Soviet missile could reach Paris, London, Berlin. And when these weapons were created by the Soviet Union, this became very troublesome to Western Europe and to the United States. And it was, I mean, one of the great stories of human interaction is the INF agreement of the late 80s, when both sides voluntarily gave up intermediate range nuclear forces. This was a very bright moment of human history. This was Nitze's work. And it began with the Walk in the Woods, 1982, when he was just talking with his Soviet counterpart. What if we could get this to stop? He was present in Reykjavik in 1987. The Reagan-Gorbachev summit, many of you are, this is recent enough that you may remember or have read about it. This was the summit in Reykjavik where they came so close to agreeing to remove all nuclear weapons. It was amazing. This happened in secret, of course, but the story came out later. They came this close to agreeing, you know what, let's get rid of the whole thing. And there are different versions of why it did not succeed. It seems that the Gorbachev and Reagan really were about to agree. I think they both got panicked. They were both panicked when they saw how close they were to this comprehensive agreement. They thought, are we ready for this? Are we ready to give up our nuclear weapons? I mean, this is a major, major change. I think they both got scared. And the issue that became the pretext for the failure of the Reykjavik talks was Reagan's insistence on Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which at the time was considered ridiculous. It was called Star Wars. That was a kind of a joke because the movie had just come out and it seemed crazy. You mean have missiles that can shoot missiles? Well, we now know from the Israel Iron Dome, it is possible to have a strategic defense initiative. In 1987, it seemed crazy. And Gorbachev said, if you insist on SDI, that's the end of the meeting. And they walked out. There's the famous picture. They're walking out of the negotiating room. They both look very depressed because they came so close to eradicating all nuclear weapons. Well, Nitze was there. Nitze was the whispering at Reagan throughout the whole thing. Of course, we don't know exactly what he said, but Nitze understood these things. Reagan had a general knowledge, and his specific information came from Nitze. So, Grand Compromise, 1988, there was success, not in eliminating all nuclear weapons, but yes, in removing intermediate range nuclear weapons, the ones that could have gone from the Soviet Union as far as Paris, London, Berlin. So that was a marvelous success. In recent years, the Russian Federation had been cheating in violating this agreement, and Trump, in his last administration, noting that the Russian Federation was cheating, canceled the whole agreement. It was a very sad moment. I don't think I can judge. We do know that the Russian Federation was cheating. Personally, I'm sorry that the INF was canceled by President Trump. I think there could have been another effort to keep it going. I think it was a great loss. Now, going chronologically, Reagan-Schultz. He was Reagan's negotiator during that period, Walk in the Woods, 1982. People in the West thought, oh, Gorbachev seems like a nice guy. Nitze didn't think so. Nitze didn't trust Gorbachev. He didn't trust any Soviet leader. He went, as I mentioned, to the Reykjavik summit with Jack Matlock. Little personal touch. I was in Scandinavia at that time, and Jack Matlock stepped off the plane after Reykjavik, came to Copenhagen, where I was a junior officer. I was no importance in the embassy. Nobody in that embassy understood the significance of the Reykjavik talk and of Jack Matlock, and they gave him to me. They thought, oh, Matlock, who's that? We'll give him to the junior officer. And so I had 3 days with Jack Matlock, and he kept saying, Dan, do you understand how close we came? We came so close. And after a couple of days, he said to me, oh, I would love to be the ambassador to that country. And he was a year later. So December 8th, 1987, the INF, this was one of the great accomplishments of Nitze. And again, Nitze, the pessimist, Schultz, the optimist, and they worked together. Fascinating relationship. Now, Nitze was moved by this concept from Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, of the harmony, the harmony that exists between opposites, and which is what creates the strength of a bow and arrow, or the tension of a stringed musical instrument. Nitze was fascinated with this concept, the harmony of the tension between opposites. And he very much took to heart this famous phrase of F. Scott Fitzgerald, who in his novel, The Crack-Up, this is a famous phrase to many Americans. The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposite ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. This, folks, is strategy, which is, again, the kind of underlying theme of the discussions we've been having. Nitze was very much taken by this phrase, and very much he read about Heraclitus and believed that if you put two opposites together, something can happen. We could almost think of the intellectual clash with an underlying friendship between Nitze and Kennan as one of these two opposites. And Nitze believed this was a positive thing. Interesting. Now, so what did Nitze call for with these beliefs in embrace the opposites, just keep producing weapons until the Soviet Union cannot keep up. He was, let's keep in mind, he was a pessimist. MAD, this concept of mutually assured destruction, which motivated both sides to negotiate. Nobody wanted to end the human race. Even the worst, even Stalin, nobody wanted for the human race to be destroyed. And so this concept, which was which motivated both sides in the Cold War, we want to avoid mutually assured destruction. Now, that said, Nitze, Kennan would have said, oh, he would have been ambivalent. He would have said, I don't know, I have great regard for Kennan, partly because he was so complex, but he really wasn't quite sure, what do you do to avoid mutually assured destruction? Nitze was very clear. Prepare for war. Prepare peace through strength. We heard this 1,000 times last week in Munich. Peace through strength. Peace through strength. If it still has any meaning, I'm not sure. But with Nitze, it was very precise. We want this category of weapons. We want to innovate and have more sophisticated weapons and more of them. to create an overwhelming force that the opposite side would never dare to challenge. Now, prepare for war, and by doing so, avoid war. Um, Challenge, do not provoke. This is the two opposites, the Heraclitus concept. Challenge, but do not provoke. This is not an easy concept, is it? Challenge, but know when to stop. Don't go too far. In that regard, Nitze and Kennan were pretty much in agreement. And then there's a list of just some of the terms. I remember being in that briefing. I didn't understand a word. They were talking about CTBT, ICBM, LEU, RV, MERV, SLICMs, BICMs, blah, blah, blah. Um, the layman, the person not imbued with these concepts, it was just complete confusion. And but I understood that there was a superior brain in there, and that Nitze, that is, he was working to to bolster the Western side during the Cold War, to prepare for war and thereby avoiding war. I remember Tom Friedman sitting, he was a junior reporter at that time, writing this down. I think, Tom Friedman at that time was assigned to weapons. That was his job. So he did understand these things before he became a generalist. So I guess we end this by saying, how did um, the Soviet Union did cease to exist? Um, the Berlin Wall, 1989, Soviet Union crashed, 1991. There's a wonderful story. I think it's true. I don't know if Nitze would have been in the room. There were arms negotiations, Soviets and NATO and Americans. And the Soviet was called out of the room. This is just a funny anecdote. Um, and for a phone call, an urgent phone call. And these things happen during arms negotiations. And a few minutes later, when the Soviet negotiator came back into the room, he was discouraged, and his shoulders were fell, and he looked devastated, and he said, "I cannot sign any agreement on behalf of the Soviet Union." And people looked at him. They said, "Why not?" He said, "I've just been informed it no longer exists." It's a nice story. So in conclusion, with this discussion, was Kennan a dove? Was Nitze a hawk? They were both realists. They were both realists. In another talk, I was thinking we could get to that today, but I think for another time, I want to show you a graph of, let me show it to you very briefly. Something we can talk about next time. Let's see. This is another presentation. We don't have time today, but at Kennan's times and Nixon, the various other individuals who were thinking and writing about strategy. You see the names here. And we can talk, this is grand, I love this slide, grand strategy. Later, I want to talk about a graph on which you can chart realism, idealism, internationalist idealism, non-interventionist idealism. And I think next time, talk about this graph. You can put any thinker, nobody's exactly in the middle here. You would have Jimmy Carter over here somewhere. You'd have George Bush over here someplace. You would have Ronald Reagan probably over here. This graph helps us think of how to situate different types of thinking and different thinkers when they're talking about these topics. I think that's it for today. If there are comments, or anybody have comments on things that happened in Munich in the last few days, I'm not sure what to think. I know that Europe was shocked. We all know that. That the things that were said by Hegseth, Vance, and others, Kellogg, also Kellogg, the envoy in the Trump administration, who has been assigned to deal with, to try to get some outcome to the current war. All three of them made comments that deeply offended Europeans. We know that. We can talk about that. I would say only, I read about what they said in the American media, and I thought, well, that's, they provoked them. And then I took the trouble to actually listen to them. Um, I'm not saying I agree with anything that they said in Munich, but it's not exactly what the media makes of it. It is more subtle. It is more um, rational than the way the media have depicted. I would urge everybody, when looking at these painful things, take the primary source. Take the trouble to actually, the videos are easy to find on YouTube. The Hegseth press conference, for example, I think I would say I disagree with maybe all of it, but when you listen to it, it has an internal consistency that you really don't get if you're getting it through secondary sources. That's just a kind of an academic comment. We are in an extreme crisis in many ways, certainly domestically in the US. The Western alliance is not what it was. It may never be the robust alliance that it might be. We just don't know. It's an important, crucial period. I encourage people, look at what's actually said. It will disturb you. You'll find it objectionable, but it's essential to listen to the primary source instead of only getting it through the filter of secondary sources. That's all I can add. Now, lacking comments, maybe we'll say goodbye for today. And next Monday, Andrew Long Higgins of the United Church of Christ. I can't wait for that, because how does a church and how do religious practitioners become useful during a crisis? We know that they are useful. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and Zoroastrians and Buddhists, they all play a role which is often forgotten when we talk about strategy. And I think that's it for today. Thank you, everybody. We're in a crisis. Keep calm, carry on, and keep track of the primary sources. Thank you. Thank you.